Welcome again to the Bibliophile.
Thank you, Nigel.
Let's start with the pronunciation.
Gregynog. The pronunciation of Welsh is always on the penultimate syllable, so it's Gregynog. A little bit like the Italian, Gregynog.
Not Gregynog, which is what you might...
Gregynog or Gregynog or anything like that. G-Y-N is always pronounced gun, so it's Gregynog. And as a place, it's Greg could be a word for heather. Nog is a place name, so you could say it was a place of the heather originally. But Gregynog is the name of a house.
And that's where it takes its name from?
That's what it takes its name from.
I see. And it's quite a spectacular house, isn't it?
Well, it is. It's actually a folly. The whole thing looks like a timber frame building, which is very typical in mid-Wales, but in fact this one is concrete rendering. Painted. It's black and white.
It looks almost Elizabethan, doesn't it?
Well, it is, but that's what it's modelled on.
Right.
But it's all concrete, painted black and white. It's a folly. It's a fake.
And whose folly was it?
It was the Hanbury Tracy's, I believe. The history of Gregynog is well documented. And there's been a house there since the 12th century, I believe. Mm-hmm. It goes a long way back. It's been a place, a homestead for a long time. And over the years, of course, houses have been rebuilt and added to, and it's changed. But the Gregynog Press, which is what you want to know about, came about when the Davies sisters, Gwendolyn and Margaret Davies, bought it in around about, 1920, thereabouts.
Yeah, the press started in 22, I think.
22,
right?
23 is when they first had this idea.
And these were wealthy daughters of some...
Their grandfather had made a fortune in coal mining, shipbuilding, and they felt during the First World War that they could offer something to the soldiers and the poor veterans from the war there, and they would establish something that we would today call perhaps an arts and crafts centre, an art centre. Mm-hmm. And they tried out all sorts of different things. They investigated the ceramics, the pottery, got a little clay around but wasn't found suitable. They thought about furniture making but couldn't find craftsmen with enough skill locally to do what they wanted, and they landed up with the notion of a printing press. They thought they would make books.
They would invite veterans to
the idea was to provide a sort of rehabilitation centre.
Right, therapy sort of.
Therapy, yeah.
Okay.
Come to the country. And this Gregynog stands in 800 acres of beautiful parkland.
It's a wonderful objective, isn't it?
And they were great philanthropists. Plus, they had a lot of money, and at that time I think they each inherited around £1 million, which in those days is substantial. Yeah. And they'd begun collecting paintings. And they had one of the most important collections of European Impressionist paintings at the time. And in Gregynog used to hang Monets and Pissaros and Renoirs.
That was their eye? Their taste, or they had advisors? Yeah. Jones, wasn't there Jones, an advisor of theirs?
Jones was an advisor on the press.
On the press, okay.
Yeah. And they were friendly through Jones with all the literary figures, and prime ministers would go and stay there.
Okay.
They were well connected.
So, continuing on then, what are some of the more interesting books that they would have published? Because they went from 22 to about 42 or thereabouts, right?
1923. Cafodd y wasg ei sefydlu 1923 gan Achwioris Davies.
What was that?
That's how I used to begin my lectures in Welsh about the history of the press. The press was established in 1923 by the Davies sisters. Cafodd y wasg. Gwasg is the Welsh word for press. But you have to pronounce that G on the end, otherwise you refer to the servant, the manservant, or the slave. So you have to say Gwasg Gregynog, which is, when I joined the press, that's what it was called, was Gwasg Gregynog. The press became known for publishing, as did many of its contemporary presses at the time, Golden Cockerel, for example, Ashendene, and so on, publishing fine books in limited editions, and particularly in Gregynogg's case, presenting, say, 10 copies of each edition in a fine binding. And Gregynog was unusual in that every stage of operation, from the typesetting through to the printing and the binding, took place under the same roof. And the Davies sisters brought people in, and it began with Maynard and Bray, Robert Ashwin Maynard and Bray there, who were sent off to art school to learn something about printing and all these various things.
And then they would be assisted by these veterans.
No, the veterans never really came into it.
Oh, they didn't?
It never happened.
Were they there at least?
No,
or
they never.
That was their goal, or they wanted that to happen, but it never did.
No, it never did. And instead they had the press. The one thing that did continue was a music festival. And that's still going on today. That's been revived. They had a literary festival and a music festival. The music festival is still going.
So you say they had everything under one roof, and including they had their own type.
They had their own monotype casters, and remember at this time in the 1920s, the Monotype Corporation was in its heyday. It was Stanley Morrison was and Beatrice Ward responsible for pioneering all these revival typefaces in hot metal. And Gregynog was using them, Perpetua, for example, before the Italic had even been released. And they were using all the Garamons and the Bembos and the Baskervilles that were brand new. It was the latest available technology.
Yeah.
So they had
what a wonderful new choice, wasn't there?
Well, there was. They had compositors and they had printers. And, of course, they appointed the first bookbinders there. And eventually it was a man called George Fisher who came and was responsible for some quite remarkable gold-tooled bindings.
Like which ones, for example? Do you have any favourites?
I do, and if I could show you them, but they're in that book underneath the tape recorder.
Oh, okay. We can have a look at that. What are the names of them? Do there any names come to mind?
Well, they do, and the ones that I find particularly interesting are those on books that were by Blair Hughes Stanton, who is someone who I want to talk to you about as well. But George Fisher himself didn't really design many of the bindings. He was just the binder.
Craftsman.
He was the craftsman. And as well, John Mason, the younger John Mason, the son of John Henry Mason, who'd been the compositor at the Doves Press, was a binder and had worked in the bindery at Gregynog there as well. And that was interesting. But everything was done under the one roof, which made it quite unique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you'd be able to, I gather, you'd be able to think through the entire thing as a unified process, which would make it that much better.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's very true. When I went there, that's one of the things that I felt that gave us an edge, an advantage, was the fact that you could do everything all together and
you could choose the type based on a particular kind of paper and select the binding that would complement, as opposed to what the typical process would be to sort of ship it out,
send it out, yes,
and get different takes on the same piece of work.
Cold in here, isn't it? Yes. Right. Well, the Davies sisters, of course, had this idea, and they appointed a board of directors, advisors, literary advisors. You mentioned Jones. I'm trying to remember his first name. Is it George Jones?
Who's this book by?
This is Dorothy Harrop's book, the Gregynog Press, that was published by the private library in 1980.
Good resource.
It's a very good resource, and it tells the wonderful story that is the Gregynog Press. It's essentially the story of the different people who were appointed as controllers, not financial controllers, but more like the managing artistic directors.
Yeah, it's kind of an odd title, isn't it? Who chose that title, I wonder?
I don't know.
But you're right. Down the line, that's what you were.
That's what I was. I was called the controller. Essentially, Maynard and Bray, who learned about printing and did also illustrate some of the books with their own wood engravings, and they designed the books. You can see where they learned from and who they learned from and what other books they looked at and what influenced them. The early Gregynog books have got all the trademarks of Ashendene, but on a smaller scale, a little cruder, perhaps we say. They were having paper made for them as well, handmade paper. They never made their own paper.
What then distinguishes it from other presses then? Design?
Well, I think the fact that they were, for the most part, produced in-house makes them interesting, and that small proportion had a deluxe binding on it. It's the deluxe bindings that really make the book spectacular. If you look at the ordinary editions, and this is a copy of Erewhon by Samuel Butler, which is bound in a local sheepskin, because there are something like, as you know, 10 million sheep in Wales, and only 3 million people. There's a lot of sheepskin to be had. It's not very durable. But even so, I think that they stamped it binding with a Gregynog Press bindery there. They were like very nicely printed trade books, some of them. Mm-hmm. The ones that printed on handmade papers are more like a traditional private press book.
They cater to both markets then?
Well, they were producing a lot of these books. The editions are quite large. It's to say not like glorified trade books, that's an insult, but...
they remind me a bit of the Nonsuch.
Exactly. And it's 300 copies. That's a reasonable edition. It's a lot of copies.
Mm-hmm.
They, of course, were publishing in Welsh and in English, which gave them a unique characteristic. But it was the fact that they were given these beautiful bindings by George Fisher and his team in the bindery there that makes them, in my mind, stand out. If you look at a collection of Gregynog bindings, they are quite something.
And that's because of the tooling on them, primarily? Primarily,
especially the gold tooling. And as I said, the history of the press corresponds to the different tenures of the controllers, Maynard and Bray, and then Hugh Stanton and William McCants, and then you get Lloyd Haberlich, and then, I've forgotten.
Look at that.
James Wardrop, that's it.
And again, each one of them put their own stamp on.
And really from the time Hugh Stanton went down, I think in 1930 and left in 1933 or thereabouts, Lloyd Haberlich wasn't a resident there, nor was James Wardrop, really. And that changed the feel of the books. Hugh Stanton came at a time when they were working on other books, and he was left to his own devices initially and produced a book called The Lover's Songbook, a collection of poems by W.H. Davies, which he illustrated with his little wood engravings, which they never published. You can read the account in here. These little engravings of little figures rolling around in bed were thought to be a little... by the
risque,
Davies sisters, Calvinistic Methodists, remember, were rather worried about these things, and they sought the advice of Stanley Morrison, who was one of their advisors, and he wrote back to them and said, well, the whole thing is totally unorthodox. And then he said, besides which, the verse are too feeble for words. So, that's a double condemnation.
Yeah. It's funny, though, the private presses have somewhat of a reputation of being a bit risque and showing nipples and breasts and such, don't they?
Well, certainly during Hugh Stanton's time there, yeah.
And they could get away with it because...
it was art.
Exactly. But they couldn't get it past the sisters.
Yeah. You see, with Hugh Stanton, he was a young fellow in his 30s. Then he came there and he designed this book all by himself. And not only was he illustrating, but he was designing in the layout for the typesetting, and he was rearranging the lines of the poems.
Okay.
There's another thing which upset Morrison. He said, you don't really do that. But it's in a letter from Blair Hugh Stanton to some bibliographer that W.H. Davies himself did not mind what he was doing to it, which is interesting. He came at a time when the market was really drying up. Fine books were no longer...
We're getting into the Depression now.
We're getting into the Depression era. And what they did was choose books with more illustrations because they were paying him a retainer and less text. And two of my favourite books to come from the old press were illustrated by Blair Hugh Stanton with fantastic wood engravings. And that was The Revelation of St. John and The Lamentations of Jeremiah. And they're both large folios, quite slim. And
affordable? Packed
full of... wood engravings. Are affordable today?
Yeah.
Sure.
Do a $300, $500?
A little bit more than that. Especially if you wanted deluxe, you'll have to pay more than that. But fabulous things.
Fabulous because of, again, the craftsmanship, the workmanship, the combination of illustration and text.
For me, and I'll tell you what makes them really interesting is that Hugh Stanton was not only illustrating the books, but he was designing them.
Okay.
So he was doing the typographical layout, illustrating them, prescribing the typeface, the initial letters, which he was also engraving. someone had given him, or he'd found a lettering alphabet that Mardesteig had published at the Officina Bodoni, the Mollius alphabet, and he based his lettering on this. And so he has some fabulous initial letters in a setting of Baskerville and using blues and red inks. And it's printed on this smooth Jap vellum, as Hugh Stanton called it, Gampi paper.
It's a coordinated
The binding
effort.
was designed by him as well. So the
Right.
whole thing was a complete package, and that makes them quite unique. It's not somebody else putting a binding on somebody else's book, someone designing a book from start to finish. To the point as well where Hugh Stanton would be instrumental in making sure that the ink that was used was mixed to the German recipe that was necessary to print his extraordinarily fine, detailed engravings. Which, of course, raised a few eyebrows because they were, many of them, for the most part, were diaphaноusly draped nudes, men and women.
What did the sisters have to say about that then?
Well, I don't know.
I guess it got through.
He got through then. Yes, what did they say? I know one of the reviews at the time said, I think it was in the Observer newspaper, said, there is something in the wild sanity of these engravings that reflects the artist's mind. So he had a reputation. And of course he came at a time to Gregynog with his wife, who was Gertrude Hermes, another wood engraver. And William McCance, who was the controller. Hugh Stanton had been offered the job as controller, didn't want it, he wanted to be the artist. Didn't want the administrative responsibility, managerial responsibility. William McCance was also an engraver, but not as good as his wife, who was Agnes Miller Parker, who was a superb engraver. And they published, during the time that these four artists were there, a great number of books with fabulous wood engravings, and particularly my favourites again are these with engravings by Agnes Miller Parker, and they were the Aesop's Fables. This is a book
We've jumped ahead here.
We've jumped ahead, but
Okay.
the engravings in here were printed for the Gregynog edition of Aesop.
Okay, and that would have been for their time.
That was their time. That was
Which is when?
33, I think.
Any other books stand out for you? That's a gorgeous one. That's what this is. Well, I don't want to jump around too much, but this is something that you produced, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, before we get to that, anything else in the 30s?
I think there's certainly from each era, there's two or three books which are great. I think from the first period, there's a Life of St. David is a wonderful little book, especially in its full leather binding. The two Hugh Stanton ones, and the Aesop of favourites. Then Bray, Lloyd Habley comes along, and I'm afraid to say that I know Lloyd Habley is an American. We're in America, and he was passionate about what he did,
Yeah.
but he didn't have the same skills that George Fisher in the bindery did, or the same typographical sensitivity as even Hugh Stanton or other people did. And I think the books are a little clumsy that he produced during his time there. I think the ones, there's the Cyropedia, which I think he did, Cyropedia, which is quite a grand book, a big book, and there's a lot of books there. That James Wardrop, who was the last person to be the controller there, produced a History of St. Louis, which is a very grand book, printed on handmade paper again. And
That looks like something out of the Dove's Press.
yeah,
doesn't it?
it echoes the older traditions. But then they went on to do a book with Reynolds Stone's engravings, a small, tiny little thing. But that's more in the non-such tradition.
Mm-hmm.
There's the Life of St. David in its fine
Full
binding.
binding, yeah.
There's the Erewhon in its special binding by Hugh Stanton, and these parallel lines, gold parallel tooling, quite remarkable. But you know, I was rummaging around in the National Library of Wales one day, and the bindery there found in one of the boxes a set of brass blocks. Binders are cunning. The whole thing was blocked before it was put on the book text block, if you like. And these are Hugh Stanton's
Bindings.
designs for the special bindings. Dark blue, heavy grained Levant Morocco, and that's one by George Fisher, which is really quite nice.
So 1942, they stop operations.
43, I think.
43. And then what happens?
It lies in mothballs until the 1970s. The University of Wales received Gregynog as a bequest, turned it into a conference centre. The Davies collections of paintings went on to form the core of the National Museum of Wales. Fabulous collection. The university decided that all the dust that was gathering on the printing equipment could perhaps be dusted off, and the person who was in charge of Gregynog, the warden of Gregynog, was a man called Glyn Tegay-Hughes, who was interested in printing and books, and they sponsored a fellowship.
This would have been when?
This is 1974, thereabouts. Then let's just say the 1970s.
Sure. And when did you become the controller?
1985. I visited Gregynog, I think 1984. I went there for a conference, a printing history conference. I can remember arriving in a torrential downpour. And you know, when I was a student at college, I asked Hugh Stanton.
Because he was a teacher of yours, was he?
He was a teacher of mine, and more than that, he was a mentor, really, in that he asked me to go and print for him at his home in Manningtree in Essex, where I learned a good deal more, not only about printing, but about living as well. And I asked him what he could remember about Gregynog, and the two things he said to me was, 3 years of bloody rain. Talking about my first visit,
right,
in a torrential downpour, it brought that to mind. It was dark, very dark in Wales, and I visited there, and of course, a highlight of any visit, any conference, was a visit to the press, which had been re-established and reopened. And Eric G. was there as the controller, and David Vickers was the compositor and printer. Well, they were both printing. So two of them were printing books again. And we got an opportunity to visit the press, as it had been in the 1930s. And it was, Nigel, like walking into the Sistine Chapel. For someone like me, a young fellow who'd begun printing books on the hand press in Newcastle, beginning to learn about the private presses and knew a little about them and had seen a number of these books, to go to the place that was actually still in operation.
Yeah, with the same equipment.
And the same equipment had not changed much at all. It still smelled. It smelt of history. Everything was redolent of creativity, and the bindery was as it had been, but wasn't being used.
So it's exciting, obviously.
Yeah, it was exactly as it was.
And the opportunity came up.
And that was in, I think, September or thereabouts. In the following year, a friend who I'd been there with said, David, they're looking for a controller. Eric G. is retiring. Oh, God, what was I, 26, 27? No, later, 85,
yeah,
so I was...
More like 32, 33.
32, I was in my 30s. I'm at the same age as Hugh Stanton went there. I thought, I can't take over the controllership of the great, revered Gregynog Press. But by this time, I'd learned a good deal about printing, bookbinding, publishing through doing my own books. And
you had your own press?
I had my own press. I was publishing. I got 6 or 7 books under my belt, and I'd been keen to learn about printing and bookbinding and the history of printing and bookbinding, and wasn't shy in showing my work to the leading practitioners. So by this time I'd already met Vivian Riddler, who was printer to the University Press at the time. I'd shown him my books. I'd been to visit Sandy Cockrell, shown him my books, and with great temerity, and learned something on Roger Powell, all these great folks. And I'd also gone and shown John Ryder my works, and these folks encouraged me.
You had a pretty good network.
Yeah, and as it turns out, I told John Ryder about this Gregynog opportunity. He said, well, you should go for it. And one of my other tutors at Central School, Ian Mortimer, who was a very well-respected printer and designer, I think supported my application. I was also, at the time, the honorary printer to the Newcastle Imprint Club, which is an informal group of bibliophiles.
Okay.
And I used to have great fun printing for pleasure, in the John Ryder sense, printing keepsakes, dinner menus for our informal meetings. And the Newcastle Imprint Club was going to be called the Half Crown Club, like the Double Crown Club, but a lesser
Yes.
importance, was run by a man called Peter Isaac, who was a civil engineer, professor of civil engineering, but with a great interest in printing history, and was a great collector of William Davidson of Alnwick, in particular, and Buick, and became a supporter of mine and a patron, a collector, if you like. And he supported my application, and lo and behold, I got offered the job and moved to Wales. And suddenly found that the road signs were bilingual. And 20% of the population spoke Welsh, for goodness sake.
So that's the question. How did the environment affect you? The people, the landscape, the climate?
Well, I used to talk a lot about, I used to travel around all over the country and in America too, talking about the history of the Gregynog Press, and I'd always start with a slide showing the British Isles and a little bit on the west coast, the western side of Britain, that is Wales. Wales itself is a country about the size of Massachusetts. You can relate to it, it's quite small. And the population there at the time, it's around about 3 million. But there are 10 million sheep.
Yeah.
Now you can imagine, 10 million sheep, that's got to have some, it's like dandruff. You dotted on in the spring, all these lambs are out there. And it's hilly, and there's North Wales and there's South Wales, and we were in Mid Wales, that's where Gregynog is. Moyndia and Maldwyn, the rolling hills of Montgomeryshire. It's very, very pretty. It's not spoiled at all by industry. Or the new town, the nearest town to Gregynog was in the 19th century famous for its woolen mills. And that's all. There's no heavy industry there. Not like in South Wales.
Swansea.
Or even North Wales with the slate mining. No, so it's unspoiled and it's beautiful. It's pretty.
And did that? How did that manifest itself in the work that you did? Did you have sort of a vision for what you were doing?
As the controller of the press, I was responsible not only for designing the books, but also for printing the books. Occasionally I would illustrate one or two. I was also responsible for editing, working with the illustrators, the authors, editors. You asked about the landscape. There was one occasion where I was called upon to look for an illustration, decided I would have a go at it too, so I did a line of cut which was hand-coloured in the actual edition.
What edition was that?
That was a little book called Dag Sonnet, 10 Sonnets by T.H. Parry Williams.
So how many books did you produce while you were there, and how long were you there for?
Good question. Well, I went in 85 and left in 97, so...
12 years.
12 years.
And how many books would have been...
I'm not sure. You'd have
coming
to
off.
Look at the...
Okay.
I don't know. I haven't counted them.
Okay. What are you proudest of? Do you have something that you'll always be most proud of?
Yes, I do. Yes, it's a book which introduced me to America, really. It's an edition of Walter Whitman.
Oh.
And it should be on the shelf there. Let's see. The book, I won a number of awards and book design awards. Got to the point where it was embarrassing. I won so many that I stopped submitting them. This was the British Book Design and Publication Awards. I won the limited edition category 3 years in a row, and I thought I should let someone else have it. Have a chance.
Right.
But the book which I won the Feliciano for was the Giraldus Cambrensis, which was a very handsome book. But the book that I enjoyed doing the most was this book of Walt Whitman poetry called Wrenching Times, and it's in a quarter-letter binding, which I designed too. It's Civil War poetry, essentially, so we've got to play on the colours.
Oh, yes, and I love the way you've got a kind of a ragged edge on this.
This is Indian paper, which is ragged, the rough and the smooth, and the red and the blue.
Oh, wow.
It's illustrated with wood engravings.
Your wood engravings?
Not my wood engravings, no. I went to New York first in 1990 to the first international conference of the book art, and saw there the many slides of wood engravings by a man called Gaylord Shanilek.
Ah, yes, he's not too far from here.
He's not too far from here at all.
Is it Wisconsin?
Yes,
yeah.
Stockholm, Wisconsin. And we met up there, and I said to him, we're working on this book, and by this time Barry Moser had declined to illustrate this edition. So I was looking for an artist, looking for an illustrator, and said, what about coming to Wales? And he said, actually, I don't know. I don't think he'd even heard of Wales, let alone Gregynog at the time. And the next day he came back and he said, okay. And that following year, he came out.
Because you want it produced there.
Yeah, I said, come to Wales, come out and spend 6 months. We got a grant, and he came out. And for me, it recreated the atmosphere that must have existed in the 1930s, where the book was being made entirely in-house, illustrated there, designed there, printed there, and bound there.
These are very colourful.
They are.
What specifically do the poems address then?
They're Civil War poems. They're the poems from drum taps. And by this time I'd visited Shanalek, who was living in Minneapolis at the time, but setting up his home in Wisconsin there. And I got to see for the first time these wide American skies, and I wanted to see some of that in here, in this book. And we created this book.
And so why is it that you're proudest of this?
Because, as I say, it's of a piece. It all came together.
It came together exactly as you wanted it to.
Yeah. I would do it differently were I to do it again. And the challenge with Whitman is the lines are so darn long. I mean, poetry is difficult. We went through various ramifications before we ended up with this solution. So cold, I can't turn the pages.
As you say, so many big skies.
Yeah. But it was a great project, and
that's interesting that it's because it came together exactly as you had wanted it to. That's why
it evolved. I think with all these books, they don't, and that's the difference between a commercial publisher perhaps who doesn't have the beauty of being able to tinker with things as they go along. They've got to come up with a design decision, and that's it.
Yeah.
And it gets printed. You can't change your mind halfway through. But with this, which is letterpress printing from metal type, you'd actually change things on the press.
Just the layout.
The layout of it, if you wanted. And if the binding wasn't working out, you could change that. Not the most economic way of doing things.
No, but if you've got the money to do it and the time and the talent.
And the great thing about working at Gregynog was we were working in a tradition which had always used the finest and the best materials and no expense spared, so I was able to do that.
Yeah. Finally, where's the press now, today? Is it, I mean, it's functioning, I know, but that's the main question, I guess.
I don't know if it is functioning.
Oh,
the last I heard was that it had been mothballed.
Okay.
Although, having said that, there was a rumour at this year's Oxford Fine Press Book Fair that somebody was doing something about reopening it.
Like, what's there right now? Is it like can a literary tourist go there and see the presses and get look at some of the books that's come off it over the years? Or
I believe you can. It's a conference centre, and you could organise a group of literary tourists to go and have a conference there. It's a nice place to visit, but don't drink the water.
So I've heard.
Yes.
Any final thoughts on the press and speaking of more recently, what you're doing? What are you doing right now?
Well, when I left Gregynog, I suppose it's by way of therapy. I turned to what I was qualified to do. The only thing I'm qualified to do, if you like, is paint. I went to art college and a degree in fine art painting. And so by more way of therapy, I think I began painting. That rekindled the notion that I should really try, to make a living out of being an artist, which is difficult. I continued to make books, and it wasn't long before I was back on my feet again and printing books on my own behalf and publishing them again. And then I felt I should write about the publishing of these books, and I produced this book called Inside the Book, which is all about making books.
Your experience of how to make books?
Yeah, probably right.
Is it kind of a how-to or more of a memoir?
It's a how-to book. The idea is that it encourages people to make books. Anybody with an idea and develop that idea and can make a book even with just a piece of pencil and a piece of paper. But if they wanted to, they could also print it, they could also illustrate it, they could also bind it. But if they were going to offer it for sale, what they were doing is publishing. So I also talk about publishing. In today's world, the book arts, there are many, many book artists who've got no idea about publishing. And I felt this was important to
connect the two, right?
Connect the two and address this issue. And I will be giving a workshop in Maine next year, and a week-long workshop on just this subject, making books and publishing as well, every aspect of it.
Where's that?
At the Maine Media Workshops in Rockport, Maine. When I left Gregynog there, I was doing all these things, printing books, and I produced this book called Inside the Book, and then for a long time, Gaylord Shanalek and I have been trying to produce a sequel, if you like, do another book project together.
A sequel to your Walt Whitman?
To the Walt Whitman.
Okay.
And one day we've shared rooms at book fairs and all over the place, and one year at an Oak Knoll book fair, we were talking about this, and I said, I want to do something about the Missouri. I'd seen the movie, The Missouri Breaks, and I felt something interesting there. He said, what about Lewis and Clark? I said, who the hell is Lewis and Clark?
Okay.
You know, I'm an Englishman.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, the following days it happened, a week later, I would go back and stay with him at his home in Wisconsin, and we went on a road trip down to Iowa, and I went and bought all the Lewis and Clark books I could find, read about it,
pretty collectible stuff too, I think.
Oh yes, I know I can tell you who's got all of the stuff too. That's another story. But the thing was, I thought this is interesting, but it was the year before, 2 years before 2006, when everybody was doing Lewis and Clark books. So that fell on its feet. But what we did decide to do, and it's quite amusing really, we decided to publish our email correspondence over the course of 2 years. And we produced a book called Ink on the Elbow. It's become something of an important book of its kind.
And what? It's an exchange of ideas on books and publishing?
And it's all about making books.
Ah.
From 2002, for a period of 4 years,
I love it.
we were embracing email, and it was just becoming fashionable.
Conversations between David Esslemont and Gaylord Shanalek.
And what we did was edit our email, and I designed and printed this book in Wales.
Well, when was that?
2002.
In Wales. Why did you do that in Wales?
Yeah, that's where I was living.
Okay.
2003 it was published, sorry.
Oh, look.
And it's got pages in from one of my wood engravings from way back when.
And again, it's just what? Kind of musings on...
It's all about making books.
Okay.
I was making inside the book during the course of this. In fact, I was writing inside the book. Gaylord was working on 3 or 4 other books at the time. I've illustrated it with my lino cuts of his farm and family in Wisconsin, where I would go and visit each year.
Mm-hmm.
With that
Old truck
there.
Oh, yeah, you've even got a photograph.
This is where I was living at the time. There's Gaylord and his tractor, and he would come and visit me, and he did a huge panoramic engraving of the little house that you showed you there, at my workshop in Mid-Wales.
So really, you're showing what people could do if they had an idea like you had.
Sure.
I mean, it's a magnificent production, but it's just as you said, right? It's like we had this idea to make a book, and look, and here it is.
And here it is, and there's examples of his. There's the New York book which Gaylord did, which I'm about to bind 2 copies of, and so on. And yeah. And this, again, we each bound, there were 200 copies, and we each bound 100. And I did 10 in a special binding. My copy, which I've just sold, actually, which is currently out there, I think, on the market for $6,000.
Okay.
So
that's good. That's good.
Talking of value and things, I was recently in England, in Northumberland. I'm looking at a book dealer's there, and you can buy 4 of my Björk books now. If you have £1,600, a few $1,000 to spend. Nice copies too, good condition.
So your works are clearly collectible, and the market is good for them.
Well, I like to think so. I have books in collections, institutional and private, across America, Europe, and Australia, Santiago. Goodness knows where else. They're all over the place. My archive is held by the University of Iowa up to 2005.
That's in Iowa City?
Yeah.
So another reason to visit there.
Yeah. That's it. It's a good place to go for many reasons.
And how can people buy your books then?
You can buy them online. You can go to my website and look at these books, or you can go to book dealers and you sometimes find them. The older ones you'll find it. These days, of course, you can search online and find all these.
What does you the best? Going to your website and buying them directly from your website?
Of course, yeah.
And what is your website?
Solmentes.com, Solmentes. And if you like anagrams, as does Garrison Keillor, who I once gave my business card to. We spent some time together in an airport lounge. He looked at my business card. Solmentes, he said, what's that mean? Sun mines? It's my press name.
Yeah.
And I had to come up with a press name because of the book, inside the book, which I wrote, my imprint used to be David Esslemont. Well, I can't have David Esslemont, the author, illustrated, printed, and published by David Esslemont, so I came up with Solmentes, which, as I told Garrison Keillor, it's an anagram of Esslemont. It sounds very grand, but it's simply an anagram.
Great. Well, thanks so much for sharing your experiences with the Gregynog, and allowing me into your rather chilly but fascinating studio.
I wish I could have given you some of my prize-winning chili, which is the subject of my most recent book, which we haven't even touched on. But,
no. Let's quickly touch on that then.
Quickly, we can touch on that. 2 years ago, I won a chili cook-off across the field.
I thought it was pizza that you were known for.
I'm known for pizza and chili and curry as well, which might well be the subject of the next book. But 2 years ago, I won a chili cook-off, would you believe it, just across the fields here at our local winery. And so, taken by it, was either I decided to turn the recipe, for a number of reasons, into a book.
You know who should know about this book is Don Lindgren at Rabelais Books. He specializes in cookbooks and antiquarian cookbooks too. So, and he's in Maine. He's in Alfred, just outside of Portland.
You're kidding.
No.
Strange things are pointing me towards Maine. The planets are aligning.
You should know about this for sure.
But anyway, this is the deluxe binding,
gorgeous.
which is a white alum tawed pigskin with a painting of a bowl of chili on the front there.
Oh, wow.
I wanted it to look like a linen tablecloth.
Tablecloth, yeah. Very, very nice.
Thank you. I really wanted to do something rough and ready and visceral and
tasty.
And tasty. When I moved to America, we lived in Minneapolis, and I printed 2 books up there, quite substantial books, a collection of Wordsworth poems, The Prelude, and a fantastic commission, which there are only 32 copies by a watchmaker called George Daniels. And I printed those on a Heidelberg cylinder. Quite substantial, fabulous books. But I thought, before I move the press down here to Iowa, I've got to build a workshop. Well, the long and short of it is that I had a commission which fell through, which meant that I had to sell that Heidelberg, and it never found its way down to Iowa. And so to continue making books, I thought, well, I can do woodcuts. And I thought, well, I'll do these vigorous woodcuts. I'd seen some marvellous, spectacular printing by a friend of mine, Russell Moret, here in the studio just after I'd won this chili cook-off. I gave him some chili. He likes my chili. They had it for breakfast too. When he left, I thought, I know what my book's going to be. It's going to be the recipe. I got rather carried away. And the secret here is there's no chili powder. It's all made entirely from scratch. From toasting the ancho chilies to making a stock, toasting the cumin, and this is the stock which you put in there too. You do everything from scratch. Finding your beef, grinding it and marinating it and so on.
Yes. So you're just sort of taking us through the whole process.
Absolutely everything. And I've become as passionate about cooking as I have about books and printing.
You're combining two passions here.
The curious thing, Nigel, is I seem to have hit on a niche market.
Like there's a real interest in food books?
Food books, but also
But
in
fine press books.
fine press books. People collect artist books about food.
Okay.
And this has found its way to the cookery school, to schools with culinary departments in Michigan.
There's one in Providence, quite a good one in Providence that you might want to
be another.
approach.
There's the colour font.
Oh,
this is copy number 6 out of.
So yeah, to number it, you've got 30 blank chilies, and you've
hand coloured each one.
Hand coloured the ones, yeah.
So it's a mixture of woodcut, pochoir, and stenciling, you know. And,
yeah, it's
other
beautiful.
things. I'm a printmaker at heart. But the question is, what am I going to do next? Because I found a market for these things.
Right. And you want to feed that market, so to speak, because there's an appetite for it.
So I'm looking for ideas.
Oh.
Curry is another passion of mine. Being an Englishman, you see, we grew up on
That's
curry.
right, after the pub. Oh. Well, thanks for sharing that.
It's been a pleasure.
Yes.
I'm sorry it's so cold here, but
this
is Iowa and it's winter.
What do you expect? Well, thanks very much again.
You're welcome.